Okay, good morning everyone. Before we start this session, I would like to first acknowledge the traditional indigenous lands that we all live and gather on today. Although this meeting is online, we still enjoy the pleasure of living within an indigenous territory. To highlight the importance of this acknowledgement, I would like to urge you following this session to visit the Native Land digital website and search the territory on which you are located. That website is www.native-land.ca. Welcome to the first performing arts session of the Actsafe Entertainment Safety Conference 2021. Prime Contractor. My name is Natalie Diaz, and I am the Motion Picture Safety Advisor at Actsafe Safety Association. This morning's session is kindly sponsored by our conference health and safety sponsor, Worksafebc. Just as a reminder, we ask that everyone please mute themselves in remote before we start this session. This session is presented by Don Parman. Don is a manager of performing arts program and services here at Actsafe Safety Association. Don also is co-founder of this conference and general industry safety representative. If you have any questions that you'd like me to ask Don during question time, please write them into the chat section at the bottom of your screens. Now, without any delay, let me welcome Don Parman.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the conference. Good to see everybody. Lots of familiar faces, which makes me feel comfortable. There are 8 pages of faces to see today. Oh my goodness. This is new territory for Will and I. We're super excited to have this many people joining us. We're at 125. Amazing. So thank you all for joining us. Welcome to this session. I'm also going to introduce Will Heller, who many of you already know as the safety advisor for the performing arts. And he's going to be joining me for this session because we kind of picked through a few details and definitely want Will's input on this. And don't be surprised if Natalie joins us for questions as well. So as many of you may or may not know, I tend to run fairly casual sessions. I like feedback. We're going to get to a point where we're going to open it up to questions to get some of this conversation rolling, which is the primary purpose of this session. So before I dive into my very short PowerPoint, I just wanted to bring everybody kind of up to speed on what the goal of this session has turned out to be. And what we want to be able to get out of the session today is we want to have a lively and respectful discussion about Prime Contractor and the issues that we face in the industry so that we can take some information back to Worksafebc and help craft a better message and some better direction we can give employers and touring groups and all of our stakeholders on how to deal with the Prime Contractor issue. And this is a lively topic at many of our sessions, which is why I thought, let's just start the conference off with it. Let's get a good, lively conversation going. And this one always proves to be just that. So really quick, I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to go through, I think we've got about seven slides to kind of give you an idea of what we are facing here. Can everybody see that? Excellent. Thank you. And Sam and Graham are my lifeboat here, so I'm always watching them. They'll give me a signal if things go sideways. As always, a respectful workplace. Please keep the conversations cordial. If you want to change your name in your Zoom windows to reflect your organization that you're with, it would help me a little bit sort out who you are, and let people finish their thoughts because we do have digital lag. Don't forget about that. We are in the digital world, and sometimes we can stomp on each other. All right, Prime Contractor. Why are we here? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cover off a few things that we deal with at every one of our sessions. Actsafe is not the regulator. Who's that? That would be Worksafebc. Those are the people you want to talk to on that side. Worksafebc makes the rules, and this session will be recorded. we're going to take the information from this session, and I'm going to get to the goal, that task that you all get to help with in a minute. But we're going to take this information, we're going to sit down with Worksafe, and we're going to talk them through what you guys tell us and give them a real-time example of the things we face in the industry. And of course, our website's at the bottom if you ever need to get more information. So the first thing I want to do is talk about some of the definitions. And the first one, I'm going to get Will to step in, and he's going to talk about the definitions that we're using, because he's also going to be going through some of this in the employer workshop, which is coming up soon. So this is a good warm up for him, and also he speaks much better to the regulation than I do. Will.
Thanks very much, Don, and thanks, Natalie, for the introduction as well. Yeah, so basically what we've done with the next couple of slides here is we've taken the definitions as they appear in legislation and a little bit of information that we can pick up through other sources through Worksafe, and tried to break them down into workable parts for what people are exposed to regarding titles and names. So the first role that we're going to talk about in a workplace is called an owner. So the owner is somebody who you would know ordinarily as maybe the leaseholder or occupier of a venue. Something like that would be an owner. Tenants, trustees, anybody. In fact, an owner can delegate anybody they want to act as the owner in regards to health and safety provisions and the provision of health and safety on their site. Ordinarily, you also have, aside from the owner, you'll have another group of people called employers. So employers are defined by the fact that every person who engages another person in work. Just note that that doesn't say whether they're paid or not paid. It says that they're engaged in work. So a lot of the questions that we see also in our industry is about volunteers, and are volunteers workers, and are they working? So we'll touch on that in a little bit. But anybody who engages somebody, if I ask somebody to go and do work for me, whether they're hired with an explicit contract or an implicit one, that means whether you've actually got something written or not, maybe they're an apprentice, that makes me an employer in those certain circumstances. Contractors and employers also have an interesting relationship that we're going to talk about a little bit more at the end of the day under the employer responsibilities session. But basically, contractors can be employers for their people who they're engaging, but they can also be workers because they've been engaged by an employer to come and do that contract work. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight on the owner and employer sides of things. Let's see who else is on the work site.
Excellent. Up next, we're going to talk about the prime contractor themselves.
Yeah, so prime contractors are a very interesting conversation, as you know. Prime contractors are generally, what will happen is you'll end up in a place where there's more than two employers at a workplace, and there's quite a little bit of leniency, so you don't have to actually be there at the same time, for example, for this to be a multi-employer workplace. Once you've determined that there are multiple employers at a workplace, you need to have somebody who's going to coordinate all of the health and safety activities so that we're not stumbling over each other or inadvertently creating hazards for other workers from other employees. So what we want to do is we create a prime contractor role. Usually this will be the owner, but they may assign this role to another group through a contract. And in the worst case scenario, things go wrong, and it's going to be the Worksafe board that decides whether there's a prime contractor agreement in place or not. So let's be proactive in determining that through contract language, I would suggest. In the next slide.
So the multiple workplace one did not get put into the slide deck. Do you have it handy there?
I do, but I don't know if I can share it off the cuff. I can do my best.
Just read it off. I think is fine.
Yeah. So I did have it dialed up when I was talking about prime contractors, but basically it's a workplace where two or more employers are working at the same time. Usually the prime contractor is the owner, unless it's been written in for an agreement for the purposes of OHS provisions. A directing contractor or employer or other person can be assigned the prime contractor role. I've got a whole bunch of really technical into the language. I know there's a lot of questions that are going to come up regarding this. I'll do my best to answer questions as they do come and as I'm asked.
Yeah, we chose not to give you the whole rundown of how the reg is written and all the bits and pieces because it's very technical and there's a lot of legalese in it. But the overarching theme, we will talk about that. There was already a note in the chat about prime contractor equaling general contractor. That's one of those perfect examples where the owner may sign over that authority to a general contractor, and then they assume for the site or the project they will take that role on. That's a perfect example, and in the construction world that happens all the time. In fact, I think it's probably the norm in most cases. We run into a whole bunch of different scenarios that make that very difficult and tricky to do, which is what we're going to talk about next. So a few of the things that we experience. Now, I've been at Actsafe for 5 years now, but I've been with the organization for more than 10 in different roles, and this is not new. This is not new by a long shot. So these are some of the things that we know everybody wants to protect their workers. Nobody wants us to play out in the news or in the public when a serious incident happens. There's still confusion on work sites, and it varies depending on, it just varies all over the map, from small community theaters all the way up to our biggest venues in the city. There can still be confusion depending on who's running the floor. And then there are still scenarios where workers don't have access to safety programs or resources. And I try not to point fingers specifically in this case, because in a lot of cases, there's just a lack of knowledge as to who should be taking on that role, depending on the circumstances you're in. And I can give you countless examples, but what I'm really shooting for today is I want to hear from everybody in this group as to what those scenarios are that we need to address. All right. So those are just a few of the things that I run into, and Will's now running into, as we go out in the industry and start talking about shows. And this is not specific. The one that keeps coming up is large concerts, but this also applies to a whole bunch of other circumstances, festival sites, film shoot, some film locations. It's not just specific to those scenarios. So what can we do? So out of all of this information and all of these discussions that we're hoping to have, or that we have been having with Worksafebc, we have tools that we can build or produce for the industry. So like a bulletin or a fact sheet would be a really simple one. I talk about that because that would be a really easy one sheet that we could get out to our touring groups that are visiting us from out of jurisdiction, whether it be across Canada or if they're coming from south, if they're coming across the border. That would be a really good piece that we could give them. Those simple things like, if you're showing up on a work site here in BC, whether it be a festival site, whether it be a film shoot, whether it be, here are some things that you should be able to expect. And that's why we need to dig down a little bit deeper into what that prime contractor role is and how we define it and how we delegate it. Prime contractor training session. Okay, so we've now got Employer 101, which Will's revealing this afternoon, I believe. Sorry, I don't have the whole the conference sessions memorized yet, which is weird. So we'll have that piece. This does get discussed in it briefly. We could do a more in-depth piece for people that want more information on Prime Contractor. And of course, collaborating with Worksafebc, which we've been doing. We've had this conversation more than once with them. They've actually done a Prime Contractor for us 2 years ago, I think, at the conference they did one, which was really well received, but we want to get that a little bit more specific to our industry. So those conversations, as you probably know, are always ongoing. So we talk with our team members, our compatriots at Worksafe, and bring these things up on a regular basis. The hope for today was that we could have a little bit more open discussion and actually call it Prime Contractor. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. There are a few people I can see just in this screen that have been through this experience with me before, where we're doing training, and usually it's around Joint Health and Safety Committee training where these questions come up. And it opens up a door that can really change the conversation for other people. So we're trying to pull it out of that conversation a little bit and help us have some better tools to guide you as we go forward, some more clear answers. Right now there's some vague bits that we kind of put forward. And that's really it for my slide deck. Those are the things that I wanted to bring up with everybody and let you know sort of where we're at. And then the next piece to all of this, and I'm going to stop my screen share so that I can see more faces, is now we need to talk to you guys about what scenarios you have or what the issues are you're seeing that come up around this, and we will attempt to have a little bit of discussion about what resources we have now or what advice we give, and also where we can go with this, and more specifically, what scenarios do you want addressed when we talk to WorksafeBC? What we'll do is if you want to speak, you can put it up in the chat, or you can raise your hand, use the raise hand feature, and we can start unmuting mics with the help of Sam Hindle, and we can start having a little bit more open discussion. If I don't have any people volunteering off the top, you get to hear my voice for a little bit longer, and we can talk about things that I've run into. I see Andrew Ryder already covering his face. He's like, no, we've had enough. Mind you, Andrew's been in sessions. Is this your third one with me this week or second? Andrew? Second. Okay, good. So he's had an easy week. He's only had to see me twice. All right. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of situations where we've run into this issue. One of the big ones, and I've mentioned already, is concerts. And I'm not going to single out venues because there's venues all over the province and all over the country that deal with this same problem. And that's where we've got a third-party contractor who has brought a band in. So they're coming in from, I don't know, Amsterdam, and they're coming in on a tour. They have no idea what the safety regulations are in our jurisdiction and what should be done. And we're about to hand over 48 crew members to help them put their show together. And these people are going to have to direct those people in work. Lighting, sound, rigging, staging, all of those things are about to happen. Not to mention just even unloading the trucks are all tasks that they're going to have to direct people on. And who coordinates all that? Who's responsible for all the safety for everybody in that room? We have some situations where the workers on the ground are part of a third-party labor supplier, and then the venue itself has hired that labor supplier to bring those people in, and then all of those people, so some of the people from the venue as well as the third-party labor supplier, are now being directed by a third party, which is some people from Amsterdam that have never worked in BC before. So these scenarios come out very quickly, and they happen fairly often. And again, this can happen right down to your small venue. If you're bringing in a circus act from San Diego, for example, they come up. They don't know the regulations in your venue. Who's in charge of making sure they know those regulations and making sure they have some safety protocols in place? That list gets very long when you start talking about all of the pieces inside those operations, the rigging equipment, the lighting equipment. You can see how this gets big in a hurry. That is just one example. Some others, convention centers, right? Lots of people have done convention center work. Convention center has its set of rules. Now we've got GMC coming in to do a big show at the auto show. They've got a great big booth. Now they've got 3 people and their own set company coming in to deliver the fake cars, the pony walls, the lighting are all coming into work in that venue. Who's in charge of making sure they're all doing it safely? And I still get questions to this day from all sorts of different venues and organizations as to who they should be reporting to. In some cases, the venue may have it totally dialed. The information just hasn't got to the right people for the organization, which is also another huge piece of the communication problem. All right, I don't see any hands up yet. Nobody else has a scenario they want to share. And keep it as generic as you want. We do not need to talk about venues specifically, but we can talk about shows or circumstances that people are running into. I'm going to go to another example that I talked to a friend of mine about in the U.S., and he sent me this. I also polled a whole bunch of people that originally I was going to have as presenters in this or panelists in this session, and they sent me some scenarios. So another one is racetracks in the U.S. We don't have many of them left in Canada, unfortunately, but they have a whole series of issues they deal with outside race teams coming to their tracks, and who's responsible for that safety piece, depending on who's presenting the race. So he gave me some examples of how World of Outlaws versus NASCAR versus different things, they have different ways that they deal with that, and they have different scenarios for each one, and how the actual venue deals with them was extremely fascinating. Thankfully, we don't do that a lot here in Canada, but we certainly have to keep our eye out for it as these things start to develop and we get more and more different people joining us, although the border's closed right now, so it's not as easy to do. I do have a hand up. I have Michelle from Mission Folk.
Hi. Thanks for this. Happy to be here. Question. We contract with the City of Mission to be in one of their civic parks. And we have our safety work and standards that we've learned a lot from you and also from Worksafe. So my question is, when we have people come onto our site, we share with them our information, but we haven't considered if this district mission has a larger safety requirement and they haven't shared that. They haven't made that necessarily a condition of our contracting with them on the space. So we follow, we liaise with the RCMP and the fire department to ensure that we're in compliance there. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whose safety requirements trump whose, or
That's a fabulous question. Municipalities working inside a municipality or inside of one of their venues is, again, another slightly different circumstance. So that's a great example. And are you okay if I use that as one of the listed examples we use, working on a municipal site? Again, part of the prime contractor role is they would have to make you sign a document that said that you're taking on prime contractor. If that's part of their package, it may be. Read the fine print. It might already be in there. But regardless of whether or not you sign over prime, if they have rules for their site, such as access and egress for emergency, fire, those kind of things, they should be sharing that with you right away. And again, one of those questions that a lot of people may not know to ask. Different jurisdictions, Vancouver, I'll use them as an example, they've got quite a extensive application process before you even get to do anything in a park or on a city site. So those boxes are kind of ticked off early on in that process. But that's a really good scenario that we can use to kind of fish through those issues and see where they land. Not to mention, it'll also help my conversations when I talk to the municipalities of BC. Because we have those conversations with several of the people in those organizations, and we bring that to the forefront, and hopefully, we would eventually end up with a unified message across multiple municipalities. I see a bunch of people going, what? I know, crazy idea. Crazy idea. Michelle, yeah?
Sorry. So we do front end load our safety plan with the district and have been very proactive about that just because we're very risk adverse. But I note that because we're in an outdoor, I don't know that they consider parks venues for the purpose of when we go into their soft seat theaters or closed environments. And so that was something I wanted to flag as well, that when we go into a civic theater, that's much more, systematized, articulated, and there seems to be well-established protocols there. And so I just wanted to flag that just even within a municipality.
Yeah, right. Like the difference between any sort of developed site, like here in Coquitlam, just across the river from my house, there's the difference between putting a show on in the open field at the stadium and in their even just walking across the field to their little outdoor arena. Those are two different circumstances. There's different risks in both and probably different rules for both, right, which apply. So those are great questions, and I'm adding all of those to that list of things. Thanks, Michelle. That's a great example. I'm going to go next. I'm going to go to Mimi Abrams, if I can. If we can unmute Mimi.
You kind of covered it a little bit. What I would classify as this is not a venue situations, whether that's a warehouse party or GVRD parks or a number of TYA situations where like, yeah, we can put the theater troupe somewhere. Yeah, this is not a venue situations.
So thanks for bringing that up, Mimi, because we're not talking about a venue. We're talking about a workplace, right? So through Worksafe's lens, it's a workplace. And bring your own venue, like Fringe. The stuff we've done over the years in the back of vans, off trailers, in closets, the things we've done, it's a workplace. And that's where the Worksafe regulations and this whole conversation about who's responsible for protecting the workers and making sure all that happens. I'm going to talk a little bit later about safety ambassadorship and safety leadership, which we'll get around to because there are other things we can do. But I want to kind of pull some of these out first before we get into it. That's a great example, Mimi. Thank you. I have just before I get to Josh, I wanted to address Joseph put in the chat. How about community group rents a venue? The contract says they are a prime contractor. They sign the contract, but aren't at a place where they have the capacity to understand that role that they've taken on or manage that liability. Well, Mr. Chung, you have hit the nail right on the head. That is a really common one that happens more often than I would certainly like. Yeah, what do we do? How do we address this? In a lot of cases, you've got a touring group comes in, they sign the contract, they sign the prime contractor line on the contract, but they've maybe never even been in the venue before. They don't know, they may not even know all the risks that exist in the space. Fly systems, electrical, pit lifts, all of those things might be things that they need to consider. And who is in the best place to talk about those safety issues is a slightly different topic, but I'm going to get back to that when we talk about safety leadership. And that's one of the big questions, Joseph, thank you for bringing it up. That's one of the big ones that we're here to address. How do we address that? Who should be taking the role? How do we fix that? Is that through Worksafe? Is that through education and training? And Will Heller has a thought. I saw that hand.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the conversation and the way that it's going. And yes, the prime contractor is responsible for coordinating the occupational health and safety activity, but it doesn't mean that the venue all of a sudden isn't responsible for sharing information regarding hazards related to the environment that they're taking over for that period of time as a renter. So it's still meant to be a collaborative journey, because like Don pointed out, if you've got somebody coming in, they might not be familiar with the workplace. So coordination means that as soon as that contract signed, you know that they're the prime. If you know that they're the prime contractor for the show, as a venue, your interest is to start informing them about hazards and letting them know the regulations here might not be the regulations that you're used to. So you're still participating in safety for that group. You're just not overall responsible, because they're bringing in presumably other groups as well. So.
As I just saw Cam's comment in the chat, I'll get back to that in a minute. But Josh Burnett had his hand up, so if we could unmute Josh Burnett.
Thanks. This kind of falls into that build your own venue. Looking at a situation where we're contracted to do, say, a music festival, we roll in a large mobile stage, and as the staging contractor, we have a very robust health and safety plan regarding the stage, outdoor weather procedures, all of that. We have touring groups that come in. We have other acts, other departments that come to hang their rigging and elements on. So we take the onus on ourselves to orient them and sort of collaborate, sharing the hazards, like you mentioned. But where does that ultimate responsibility fall? I mean, we kind of draw a little bit of a line between you have to work safely on our stage or you don't work on our stage, but we get some of these gray areas, especially with touring acts that come in and kind of run by their own rules. So who becomes ultimately responsible for that? I mean, we're not the prime contractor, but we're taking it on to protect the health and safety of as many people on the site as we can. But there's a limitation. I mean, we can't enforce. So, right? How do we do this? We're not at the top of the food chain here, but we want to keep everyone safe.
Exactly, and that's a big part of this information piece. We want to be able to supply some more information on how best to guide you. Again, remember, there's no magic bullet, because every situation is slightly different. For example, if it's a municipal body that's bringing your stage in, that might be a slightly different rule than if it was, say, a large producing company bringing you in that's also renting it from a municipality. Where does that chain end? And that's a good question. Nobody is ever really off the hook in this scenario. It's just they're going to follow either the money or they're going to follow the equipment, depending on which part of the piece is responsible for that. And that's where we want to give people a little bit more clarity as to what to watch for and where you should be taking responsibility for what pieces. So those are all great questions. So that's another really good scenario. Portable stages, oh my goodness. And I've worked with several over the years, and the staging companies are great. They've got exceptional plans. They know the gear inside out and backwards, and they will stop me from doing stupid stuff on their stages, which is exactly what you should be doing. That's excellent news. Thanks for that, Josh. That's amazing. Thank you. Up next, we've got Dave Wilson, who, just so you all know, Dave is on the Performing Arts Standing Committee at Actsafe. Hey, Dave.
Hi, and with IATSE 118, excuse me, Vancouver. Thanks, Don and Will, for this. I wonder if you might want to add a little bit of information that on the for us on the that terrible Radiohead accident in Toronto a few years ago. There was where the stage collapsed. There was an inquest that went on for a while, and there were hundreds of recommendations, including that Ontario should have an Actsafe type organization as well. But a lot of it revolved around Prime Contractor, and that nobody felt they were responsible. And it wasn't just in the mounting of the event. It was especially in post accident, and who was responsible after that, and wasn't, and nobody was, or nobody thought they were. And it was just it was a terrible thing. So there are hundreds of recommendations. So with those recommendations, I think we may see some changes in Ontario that may filter their way through to BC.
Great point, Dave. And I want to back that up a little bit with that's kind of the worst case scenario for us, right? Like that's exactly how we don't want these things solved. We don't want it to be part of it. I mean, that's 7-8 years on now that's been going on. I think as a safety person, the whole scenario was terrible. The way it played out, there was a lot of this going on. And that's what I'm hoping Actsafe can find enough information to help people avoid some of this. And we definitely don't want this to play out publicly, because any of that stuff will affect the industry. Look at look at the impacts from the Radiohead disaster. The Radiohead incident has impacted us across the country, right? How people look at what they're going to do. I mean, the band didn't come back for 3 years because they didn't want to deal with that kind of environment. Will Heller.
Yeah, I have to say it's all too common that safety legislation and change actually occurs after tragedy. Every April 28th, we take a moment to remember people who've lost their lives at work, and it happens too often. So I'm really thankful that we've got a forward-thinking group here who's trying to ask those questions before we suffer one of those tragedies to get to the answers. And hopefully we can learn from investigations of other things that have happened elsewhere to help build our solution. Or maybe it's not a solution, but maybe it's an improvement from where we are today. When we come back next year, we're a little bit more clear on how those lines look. So I really appreciate you bringing that forward, Dave.
Yeah, there's so Alex Liveland just posted a comment in there about how when you follow the money, you also get third-party payroll companies involved. That's another whole layer of interesting, because there are several examples out there where payroll companies also take on the role sometimes of doing Worksafe paperwork, Worksafebc paperwork, which involves another whole layer of complexity. So in theory, all they're doing is filing the paperwork on behalf of the employer. The tricky piece is, if there's an investigation into those activities or those incidents, were they there? Do they know who did the investigation? Do they know? So that's a very deep well. Thank you for bringing that up, Alex, because that's another one that throws yet another wrench into these things. Motion Picture deals with this a fair bit because they use a lot of payroll companies for a big portion of their paperwork and their management of their benefits and their programs. So it's something that we definitely have an eye on, and that's one that I will make sure that we throw that into the conversation with Worksafebc. Not that actually I don't think changes the prime contractor, because I don't think the very rarely would the payroll company sign off as a prime contractor, but as part of the reporting and investigation stream, it can definitely muddy the waters. So it's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. And I've asked them kind of about that, but as more companies are taking on payroll companies to help them with their bits and pieces of their operations, it's going to become more and more influential for sure. So let's talk a little bit. Anybody else got some more examples or stories they want to tell? Because this is really good information, and being able to say to Worksafe, here's the conversation, here are the actual people talking about the actual thing. is super important. So if you come up with more, just put your hand up and we can go to you. Or if you have questions that will get us further down the road. Comments like Alex Livland's are excellent. Those bring those smaller pieces of the puzzle to the forefront. We can add them to the conversation with Worksafe BC. Payroll companies or unions are not directing the workforce. Does the payroll company have anyone on? Yeah, all those, all pieces that fall into that. And we've had a couple instances where I've actually got phone calls where Worksafe's like, do you know who this organized? And I'm like, it's a payroll company, so they have to go back and kind of trace that back. A competent prime. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, all the scenarios that you bring up, and some of the time the cloudiness that exists. Really, regardless of that's why I say we're trying to improve it here rather than solve the problem, and that is because at the end of the day, Worksafe is going to make the decision when things go wrong, and really, if we're trying to prevent things from going wrong, we need to understand where our responsibility lies and take that responsibility, and use that, and not look at loopholes and things like that to get around our responsibility for safety of the workforce. And the general public indeed too.
Yeah, so the question just came up. Michelle just posted that. Would Worksafe be the place to identify that water? Right now, unfortunately, when we get into some of these conversations, that's where I have to send a lot of people. Go ask Worksafe, because again, without them having a better understanding of what the exact situation is, it's really hard to identify. It's super tricky. There's other bodies that can do some of that work. Municipalities have their own set of rules. There's the federals at the docks and on their properties, military, they have their set of rules that are fairly clear. But Worksafe does spend a lot of time kind of translating a lot of that, and a lot of the work they have to do on site is do that. Even when they come for an inspection, an on-site visit, they have to kind of navigate who they should be talking to as they walk. If you think about a festival site, the first person they're going to run into is a volunteer at the box office, and they're going to go, who's in charge of safety on this site? And they're going to go, I think it's Dave. Well, Dave is the volunteer coordinator. They go to Dave, and Dave goes, I think it's the production manager. Then they wander on. So those are those chains that kind of need to be clear, and that's a really good example. I mean, don't forget, I ran Folk Fest in Vancouver for years, so this is very real for me. So when people would come to the gate and there was a safety issue, who were those people to report it to? So getting that clarity is also part of this. In the end, as Actsafe, as a safety person, I don't particularly care who's prime contractor. What I care about is that people are protected, so that there's a system in place, there's a reporting structure, there's people know where they need to go, they need to know who to talk to. Crazy World, just kind of parking through. Any other comments I need to follow up on? You don't have
Actually, there was a question about licensees and what their role was that's popped up in the chat. According to the definition of owner, licensee would fall under the owner classification, and therefore, without having an assigned role of prime contractor elsewhere, it could very well be the prime contractor as well at a multi-employer worksite. Did you have any thoughts on that, Don?
Well, so let's bring up the other kind of nasty piece to that is,
yeah,
if we don't define this, even if we don't define it, even if there's still not clarity, Worksafe's going to figure it out. So they're going to come in and they're going to assign that responsibility based on the activities that are happening. And then the other piece to that is nobody's off the hook. They can go after every step along the way. They can penalize, or they can talk to the worker, the supervisor, the contractor, say the person who owns the portable stage, and then they can go after the producer of or they can also pull the producer of the event, which they may determine as prime. So that's why we want them at the table to have that conversation, which is what we're getting to. So that'll be the next step after this conversation, is we'll roll them into the conversation and see where their appetite is for how we're going to get this information forward. And in some cases, I've done work where I've tried to identify it for the producing body or the festival or the show, and then Worksafe's had a slightly different interpretation of it. And that's with me going to Worksafe and going, hey, potentially if this was happening in this park, who would you consider the prime? And they would go, well, most likely this, but there's a bunch of things that we need to figure out inside that, and back and forth. Even with that, I've had on-site that decision be made in a different direction. So it's not a perfect system, but what I want to do is get some more information so we can give you better direction. The question about municipalities, that would be one. Pull them into the conversation, see if we can come to a little bit more of a consensus on which way to point people. There are also municipalities and other operations that don't have a lot of safety direction to begin with. So that's another deficit that we kind of need to work on. That's what we work on all the time, is talking to all the other organizations about having some safety language in place, whether it be in contracts, whether it be in rental agreements, whether it be just a general safety philosophy for the venues and the people that they're working with. Those are all pieces that will help with the conversation as we move forward. Oh, I got some hands in the air. I'm going to go to Tom Giroux.
I had a question about, and it concerns municipalities, and quite often, you know, municipalities, especially if you're setting up your own venue, they will have regulations for things like power, fire exits, fire extinguishers, all those. But then all of a sudden, we do crazy stuff like, hey, we're going to, you know, hang an acrobat hoop. And it's like, well, okay, our municipality has no idea how to deal with that. So and then do you have to, like, all of a sudden you're taking, okay, we're going to follow this regulation from these people and this regulation from these people. How does that play into this?
Good question. Yeah, so municipalities don't really deal with the specifics inside of a room. Is that the best way to look at it, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, there's building code. Then there's your business license and inspections. There's all those pieces that play along with it, but they're not going to check, you know, the floor jack you bring into your automotive shop. That's outside of their world. That falls in BC under Worksafe BC, so because it's a work activity. So those can be broken up into different. Where it gets really interesting is when you've got a venue that does that a lot, and now you've got, as part of your business plan, you're now a circus school. Now you have to look at the engineering components of the building. Well, you should be looking at them anyways before you hang anything. But as a business model, they should be asking those questions. And that's a really interesting one, because a local jurisdiction here, when a circus school moved a few years ago, I went in to have just have a visit. We were chatting, they were asking me questions, and I was like, okay, when you got your business license, how many questions did they ask about that? And they said all they wanted was a engineer to stamp the plan. I went, all right. So, but again, they relied on a third party to kind of do that thing. So there's no clear answer there. In BC, I would say that you have, if it's a workplace, you have a duty, of course, to make sure it's safe. And then you go down that deep well of qualified person to do the work, right? Making sure that everything's engineered. All of those bits and pieces start to come into play. But again, that is if we have identified who's responsible for the safety, which again is that loophole. Especially when you talk about things like nightclubs and places that aren't necessarily always a performance venue, and all of a sudden they add that in there. Do you have qualified people to help with the safety elements of that as the owner or licensee or leasee of the building, right? And that's where technicians like us kind of have to keep that conversation going forward, make sure it's addressed.
Right.
Great question. I don't know. I'm positive I didn't answer it, but hopefully I gave you a little bit more information about how that hierarchy kind of works. And just so you know, there is very often a disconnection between municipal building codes, fire codes, and workplace activities. They can be treated very differently. So you have to look at that as well. The fire department will come in, they'll look at a whole bunch of stuff and never be concerned about the fact that there is a 40-foot set piece that could block 3 fire exits if they move it the wrong way, right? So that disconnection is always there, which is a super fun one to navigate when you're doing site visits. Okay, I'm gonna thanks Thomas. That's a great comment, and I'm gonna move on to Mr. Chris Sprague, who, by the way, is also in the Performing Arts Standing Committee at Actsafe. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thank you very much, Don. The other Don. I'm glad you enjoyed those videos I sent you last night. Anyway, another dimension we're not even talking about yet, and I hope we can at some point, is the fact that regardless of who the prime contractor is, there might be a major conflict of what your prime contractor health and safety policy is versus what your own employees within the venue health and safety policies are. And I'm literally sending people into a burning building because the Prime thinks it's okay. You know, we've got this under control, and our guys are going, or our guys and girls are going, no, it's not good, and we are now refusing to work. So
Chris Sprague, everybody, just nailed like 5 things all in one. So right to refuse. Thank you, Chris, because that's also a really big tool we have to remember that our people have. And I have this conversation a lot when I go into workplaces or I'm talking to people that are asking about who should be taking the lead on safety. I often have to go as far back as to say to them, look, you just need to let everybody know they have the right to refuse unsafe work.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's not really the avenue we want to use, to be honest. If they do that, then Worksafe BC is going to be on your site. Right? So that's going to bring them in, and probably not the outcome you want. However, it is a tool that we have to be able to use. So if there's confusion, I've had it happen many times where I've just said to people, look, call Worksafe. This is I can't help you through this. And because of the relative short time frame of our, right? So even in bigger venues, it's still, that client's only in for a day, 2 days, 3 days. Film shoots, you might get up to 5 or 6 days, but that's still fairly short term. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to navigate that prime contractor piece or responsibility piece in that short time frame, right? But I'm also going to back up to Will's earlier point about coordination. So that's a big conversation. And many of us have been talking about this with COVID, right? We've been talking about what your plans are, and Worksafe was very, very clear about COVID. They said if you're going to have people come into your venue, their plan has to meet or exceed yours. I love that language, and I love that they put it that way, because in theory, that's what we want to see on the safety side in general. They should meet or exceed your plan. And I think we'll get back to that leadership piece in just a minute, but that's a great point, Chris. Thank you for bringing it up. Will?
Yeah, I was going to just support what you were saying in that when you're assigning a prime contractor role and now they're walking onto your site, it should be clear to them that your venue rules still stand as the rules. And ideally, you work together to negotiate those ones that are going to be sticking points for either group before you have workers on the ground. I recognize there's a lot of pressures and times involved, but that would be the ideal situation. So, yeah, certainly it comes up.
Yeah. And Cam's question, can Worksafe establish that a client was incorrectly assigned prime contract? Yes. I can answer that one. They certainly can determine that. Yeah. They can also change very quickly. They can redefine contractor in a workplace, okay, or prime contractor. And I've seen that happen before. And it's usually not, anyway, I've seen it happen before. So the short answer is yes. We won't go all the way down that rabbit hole, because that gets in, and most of this comes out of investigations. So most of this is triggered when somebody has been injured, there's been a near miss that's been reported, or somebody has refused unsafe work. And then that will trigger them to come in and start asking lots and lots of questions and go down that road. Right. Part of this is, one of the questions I've had for Worksafe for a while is, as a business owner or as an employer, people are really reluctant to go talk to them about their potential situations because they're worried about being told no, you can't do that, or they're worried about repercussions down the line. So that does make it, I have a really good rapport with them, and I can ask them these questions without naming a venue or a show, and they'll give me pretty clear direction to send to somebody. But employers themselves are still shy to do that. Worksafe does have a really deep well of knowledge because they make the rules, and also a lot of their people have dealt with a lot of different scenarios in construction, transportation, and other areas. So they do have a lot of experience, and they have given me great direction before. But there's still that reluctancy to go talk to them because people are worried about, if I talk to them, does that now put my company on the radar, and are they going to show up in 2 weeks for a surprise inspection? And I do not blame them, right? And I do not blame employers and organizations for having that fear. How do we get around that? Well, hopefully we can do that work with Worksafe on your behalf, and sessions like this will help us clarify that a little bit so that we can answer them better and have better information for you.
So I just wanted to take a minute while you're taking a breath there, Don. There was a question on the site. We're working on our change offs, but we'll get better over the course of 2 days. But yeah, there's a question on the chat there saying, can the prime contractor change during an event? For example, load in is one and load out might be a different one. So ideally, that's not the case. It's hard to coordinate a bunch of multiple employers at the same work site if you're trying to allocate a different prime for each one of the activities. The intent is to have a place where all the groups can get together and discuss safety so that the workers aren't going to be negatively impacted, usually inadvertently, by work being performed by another employer. So yeah, good question. The idea is to have a prime contractor for the duration of that event contract.
Thank you for that, because there's a really good example of that. There's some producing companies that will do things like the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. Right? That is one that, it's not now, but previously it used to be one company built the whole thing and essentially handed it off to another company to run the event, and then they came in and took it all down. I mean, that's changed over time because of things, but that used to happen. So that would be a situation where prime could change. Prime, you're basically handing the keys over to somebody else, and that could change. But the key is, it has to be really clear. It has to be in writing. And there has to be a plan on how you're gonna deal with that, right? So those scenarios are not necessarily not going to happen. They could. And another, here's a good one for you. Here's a good prime contractor situation, which isn't actually a situation, but could be in certain circumstances. School districts that build theaters, they build a theater into a high school, and then they hand the keys to a drama teacher. Okay? That's one of those situations. Now, prime is clear in that case. It's going to be the school. But if you were in a situation where you're building a facility and then handing it off to a renter, that's where, or a leasee is taking over your space, that's where that prime shifts, right? Chris Sprague pointing at himself there. So those are really key places where you want to make sure that is very clear. And you want to make sure those roles. Now, in Chris's case, when he does that, his workers are still in the space, which changes the conversation again, right? There's lots of big arenas where there may be 140 people from a labor supplier. There might be 25 people from the touring show coming in, but there's still 5 people from the venue that are running forklifts or, manning the desk at the back door. They're still part of that safety plan. Even if they've signed off prime, they still have to be part of that plan. So let's, venues owners need to have updated lists, SOPs. Yeah. Great conversations going on in the chat. Sorry, I'm not able to keep up because I talk too much. Will, anything we need to pull out of there? How about?
Yeah, I'm just looking at a question that came across. It was asking about COVID-related safety concerns and how that affects contracts and whether a lawyer or a professional should create contracts for a contractor in that situation. And I think actually we've got a great session coming up a little bit later on that might answer that question, and it'll be hosted by Steve Edelman, and it's on the second day, called Breaking Up is Hard to Do, and it's contract language about cancellation, probably particularly going to be relevant to COVID.
The other one that you may want to is we're also having one about COVID training, which we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
That's going to be a real fun one.
About those bits, but the short answer is yes, you should have some language in there. So where was I going with this? Well, I derailed the train of thought.
You derailed it or I derailed it?
It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Okay, so keep the questions, and Chris Sprague has his hand up again.
Hey guys, hi. It was great that Will brought up the whole thing about COVID, whereas the venue owner and the incoming group have to share and combine COVID plans. Why don't they just go one step further and say, you have to share all your health and safety plans, and then we could just stop this conversation right now.
I think you've read the future.
Stop crying, Don. I know it was an epiphany. I know.
You've read the future.
Get out of my head. Just get out of my head. So, yes, let me back that up a little bit. There is one small bright spot from this COVID thing, and that is, A, people now know who Actsafe is, and B, more and more people are starting to say, this would have been so much easier to handle if we'd had a safety person on our staff. And I'm just like, yes, amazing. That is exactly the thing. So you're going to hear me talking about this more and more, and through this whole conference about dovetailing that into COVID is one hazard. It's one biological hazard that we have to deal with. All the others still exist. And up to this point, we've done all this without people dedicated to safety. And I'm not saying you have to have a full-on, full-time safety person. You need to have a role in your organizations. Even small organizations should have one. Because a lot of the questions, and then I don't need all 5 people from your organization to come and talk to me. You have one person that comes and talks and asks the safety questions. Because as pleasant as I am, you don't really want to talk to me that often. So that helps spread that workload out and gives you a contact point. So when the next pandemic happens, yes, I said it, when the next one happens, you will have somebody that is the point person to deal with that stuff. There's all sorts of other things that we can do as we go further down the road. Right now, what we're talking about is identifying who's responsible. Who is the person, body, organization, or piece of the puzzle that should be taking that role on? Once you know that, then there's a whole cascade of other things that we can do. Safety coordinators. You're going to hear me talk a lot about safety coordinators. Right now, the buzzword is COVID coordinators. Well, we're going to start switching that conversation to safety coordinator, because that's the more important role in our, we're safety people, so we're of course going to take that on. There's a bunch of other things that spin into that. COVID has brought that to the forefront, and Chris is exactly right. I've been talking to venue after venue after venue where they now, and unfortunately it's falling onto a lot of the technical directors, and in some cases, the people who do the bookings for touring houses, right, or for road houses, are having to do this work, where they now have to be able to look at 2 sets of plans and make sure that that's going to happen, that they meet or exceed the house plan, which is the key to the whole thing. And there's, I've been doing it for 5 years, and I'm still learning, mostly from Will, what all those pieces are and what we should be looking for. So it's kind of a moving target for many of us. But those are exactly the questions that you should be asking.
Yeah, I was going to support that as well, and just say that it's not particularly unique to this environment, actually, that people who are doing safety, it's one of their many responsibilities, and they're trying to run it off the side of their desk, or maybe your organization doesn't have the ability to bring on that staff member as a resource automatically. And really, those are the groups who should be taking advantage of everything Actsafe has to offer. We've got advice that we can provide on individual scenarios in a more private setting than this. We keep everything confidential. We've got courses, we've got resources, we're up to date. We have industry perspective. So actually, when we talk about employer responsibility session later on, and when we're talking about COVID safety plans, we're not just looking at a singular safety plan that we developed and wondering, how good is this? Or we've got a health and safety program we downloaded off the internet and changed the name to say our production. Is this going to meet the mark? And those questions are there. Fortunately, Don and I are in a position where we see quite a lot of that material, and we're able to help people to improve and strengthen and understand what they're saying. We want you to understand what you're saying and be able to achieve it. And so, yeah, I'd certainly encourage everybody to reach out with questions anytime, not just at the conference. But that's a great point, Chris. And yes, it does take a bit of time to figure out safety, and it does take a bit of energy and resources, but it's time well spent.
Agreed. So I don't see any hands up at the moment. Is anybody? Am I missing any, Sam? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the leadership piece. And this is where right now, what do we do? What do we do until we have a clear message from Worksafe? We have better language. What do we do? And this is where I talk about safety leadership. So to be blunt, venues have the most control. From what Will and I can discern, venues have the best place to control these hazards because they know the space. Even if you're bringing in third-party contractors to supply labor, in a lot of those cases, those third-party suppliers are still going to be giving you regular crew. You're going to get the majority of them. You'll have the same crew chiefs. If you're on a union roster, there'll be a lot of the same people coming in that venue. So the venues have the most control over that, and then integrating what the renters or clients are doing in the space is a little bit easier. So there are many venues that already do this, regardless of whether or not they've done the work, of whether or not they're truly the prime contractor. They are doing this work, and it's from our position that is the easiest way for me to get information to them. Is the other thing. If I'm trying to get information out, and it's the client every time they come in the room that's supposed to be taking care of that, it's a revolving door that we can't even keep up with. But the venue we can get information to, and they can disseminate it to all of their renters and clients as they come in and out of the building. And that's from our perspective right now. There are lots of venues that are doing it. There are also a lot of contractors that are doing it. There are third-party labor providers that are just saying, look, we are going into a venue, this venue that has no safety plan. We're taking it on for all of those workers, as well as supplying first aid for people that might not be in their crew because there's nothing there, there's no guidance. And those are things that safety leadership is starting to take on more and more as people talk about it. And I won't, again, I'm not going to point anybody out, but there are certainly some people that have been taking that on more and more, rather than doing this, right? Rather, they'll just say, bring it here, we got it. They've made plans for independent venues. They've made plans for multiple rooms that they work in. And I've seen it actually work backwards, where the third-party labor provider or contractor that's in the room has actually gone to the venue and said, okay, look, we made the safety plan last year. Why don't you take this piece of work we've done and just apply it to all of your clients? So that conversation is happening slowly, but it's another information piece or way that we can get venues, owners, and primes on board with that whole safety plan. There are several examples around the province of where that doesn't really happen, and that's why I want this conversation to keep going forward, so that we can answer those questions on behalf of other venues or give them better guidance. What else are somebody previously asked, what are the best qualities for a fabulous prime contractor? Will, you want to start on that one?
Sorry, I was looking at a different one higher up. Could you just read me the...
Someone previously asked, what are the best qualities and actions of a fabulous prime contractor?
Okay, if I was looking for a prime contractor, I want to find somebody who's familiar with, first of all, ideally familiar with the venue to some extent, and the people who are running the venue, because they're the most familiar with what's happening today, even if I'd been there 6 months ago. I'd also want to have a good working relationship with the people that I'm bringing in. So if I'm bringing in a lighting crew, I want to know who from that crew I can talk to about health and safety things that come up. And I want to have those existing. I would say relationships is probably one of the top qualities. Another one would be knowledge of what they're actually signing up for as the prime contractor regarding the legal requirements within the activities that are about to be undertaken. That would be another thing. And those would probably, between those two items, other than that, it's soft skills, right?
I love Travis's comment in there. It has a great culture. I would say great safety culture in this particular. But absolutely, Travis, it's definitely something you want to look for.
Ideally, they're collaborative. So that they can yogurt.
I'll dive back into that in a second, but I want to hear Chris Sprague's got his hand up. Chris.
Why am I hogging this conference? Listen, I think something hearkening back to the COVID policies that we have now. In our contracts, we essentially say, if you don't have a COVID plan, you're using our COVID plan. And I would echo that again with your health and safety policies. If you don't have one, you're going to be working under hours. And here's a copy. I hope you enjoy it, because it works well for us, works well in our venue. You're now in our venue. Enjoy. If you haven't proposed anything or put anything forward, you're working under our rules. And I think you, the venue owners, are going to be well protected taking that approach.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's absolutely right. Travis Robertson has his hand up. Good to see you, my friend.
You guys hear me loud and clear? Hey, how's it going,
Gotcha, brother.
Don and Will? Nice to see you guys.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I just wanted to back up a moment there and talk about culture. And Will, you you kind of hit the nail on the head with what you were talking about. With some of the great things about a prime contractor. But I have the pleasure of doing a lot of work with another association on culture all across BC. And I cannot emphasize enough to everybody out there, prime contractor can have the best plan in the world. Talked a lot about COVID. They can have the best COVID plan in the world. But if these prime contractors don't have a good culture around that to implement it, well, it doesn't mean anything. So for me, an organization's big or small, culture is king. At the end of the day, it's king.
Amen, brother. Yeah, and Will and I talk about that a lot. Anybody who's done training with us already know that as part of safety for supervisors and for joint health, it's all about culture. It's all about communications. It's all about transparency. It's all about those things. So absolutely. So there was a question that popped up. What potential risks to individual workers exist if a prime contractor is not clearly identified? Fabulous question. So again, any gaps in a safety program, any gaps, mean that a worker can have no way to report. They can have no access to the safety programs in place. They could have no knowledge of what hazards are in the space. All of those exist right off the top if that prime's not clearly identified, right? If there's not somebody responsible and making sure that work's being done. I do want to just back that up with all the workers in the province are protected by WorksafeBC. Regardless of how that is happening above you, if something happens, workers are covered. Now, how that plays out in an investigation through WorksafeBC, that's another whole session we'll do another time, and we'll pull in some other people to help us with that. The Employers Resource Group and the Workers Resource Group would come in and have some of those conversations. But those are the two big pieces, right? Again, if we don't know who's in charge, it falls apart very, very quickly, right? You walk into a big convention center and you're working for somebody, and if the top of your organization doesn't know what the plan is, this happens almost right away, right? So without that top piece, it really makes it hard to, even for us giving advice to groups, we can tell you what to do for your specific activity, but who to report it to is often for us very frustrating because we don't know who to send the information to, who to be asking the questions of, because we don't know who is ultimately in charge of that venue. So I'll take a little bit of this personally. It's super frustrating. So I want to dig that. Part of this is personal. I want some better information so I can do my job. All right. The worker should know who their safety person is. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually going back to that culture conversation, a lot of the things that we hear, I know we're talking about prime contractors and various roles and responsibilities, but a lot of the things that I hear from industry is that taking it out of paperwork and making that happen is a real, it's a really interesting thing. Employers are interested in the workers being empowered to do their job safely. Workers are interested in being empowered to get home in one piece. And so everybody has in the best interest to work safely. And let's remember that that's really a priority. Yes, we need to have these bounds to work within so that we can roll and cascade a venue's COVID plan to the people who are coming on site, for example. But at the same time, the people who are coming on site, we want them to understand that they have a part to play that relates to them as well, and to be a part of that communication and to attend training if they're going to take on a venue. If you've got a singular artist showing up at a venue and they don't have a COVID plan, sure, they can sit down with the venue person and say, what's your COVID plan? Let me just understand, do I have a chance to ask some questions about certain things? Do you have a map showing where I should be walking from the green room to the stage, or where I should be warming up? And have that conversation early on, and that's going to lead you to success, regardless of where the plan originates.
Excellent. So a couple other things have come up in the chat there, one of which was, could the lack of understanding of knowledge to the workforce on a work site about who the prime contractor be considered unsafe working conditions? Good question. I know it could lead to it for sure. I can tell you 100% it could definitely lead to unsafe working conditions. That is one of the questions I would take directly to Worksafe and just go, in itself, not identifying prime, is that considered an unsafe working condition? I will ask them. I don't know. Will, do you have thoughts on that? Have you been down that road before?
I don't know. It's tough to answer because, if the prime contractor is directly involved in providing you and directing you in work, then that might create an unsafe situation. But if the prime contractor is removed, like I suggested in the comments. If the prime contractor is in contact with your safety person for your employer, and your safety person is in contact with the worker who's doing the work, then knowing who the prime contractor is should not really influence, ideally, because your safety representative, or your JHSC, if you've got a joint health and safety committee, those are the contacts that talk to that coordination of safety. Coordination of safety is the role of the prime contractor, not making sure that everything along the line is safe themselves. They're depending on all the various groups to participate, which is one of your rights.
Absolutely. Yeah. Chris Sprague.
Yeah. I mean, every employee, regardless of who hired them, has the right to know what the health and safety policies and procedures are, period. Whether it be, staging company, the convention center, whoever. And in lack of, if the staging company comes in with a lack of safety policy and procedures, then it's got to default back to somebody and something. So even if I hand them the convention center health and safety plan, they at least have to be informed and educated on something. You just can't show up and not know anything about health and safety for that particular company, that particular venue. No, everyone has a role to play in that.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I'll say it again. How much do I, as a safety professional, care about Prime? Less than I care about leadership. Again, there was a question about what if you have two people claiming prime contractor and they won't relinquish. Well, it's happened before. There's been a couple of occasions where that's happened before. I had it happen to me personally many years ago when I was working for another big corporate or convention company. So it can happen. In which case, again, follow the best plans and best direction you can, or your own. If you're one of those partners, follow your own plan and converse with the other body. But yeah, it gets very confusing very quickly, especially when you have like two crew chiefs giving different directions. That's a big problem, and that's definitely one of the things that this conversation helps solve. In theory, will help solve where that should lie, like who ultimately has the ability to do those things. So super tricky, and it changes, like you say. I'll give you an example of where safety leadership gets really weird. And prime contractor, regardless, I've walked into several of the venues of people who are in this call right now, and their crew still thinks of me as a crew chief when I walk in on some gigs, and they're like, "Hey Don, what do we do about this?" And I'm like, "Guys, no, no, I don't work for any. I'm just a visitor." So those are also things that can add to that whole conversation, because traditional roles of crew chiefs or production managers and those kind of things come into play. But don't forget, Prime C also works in projects your own personal property. Yeah, exactly. So when you're at home and you hire somebody, prime contractor, things happen. So, right. So part of the conversation we've had with Worksafe is that whole thing about, in the end, yes, you should know, but the investigations will always follow the money, responsibility, and plans. So the better you are at all of those things, the less important the prime contractor question is, as long as all the workers are protected and things are happening. Like I said, I've been in situations where the prime was a renter and the venue was not, but it didn't matter because the communication was really good. It was seamless. You didn't know that there was a difference between the two. And that's where the gap comes up for a lot of us that have had this conversation, is that's not very seamless in some settings, in some situations. So trying to get closer to that answer is why we're here today. Anything else in the chat that I've missed? Because it's kind of flying along. I'm always curious when Andrew Ryder's name pops up, so I'm always checking. I see that. Homeowners Prime. Anybody else have any other examples that they want to share, or potential situations that will come into play? Chris Sprague again. Go.
Am I going to get win a hat or something out of this? So I would think in my scenario, in my present role, is when we're dealing with a trade show. Picture, I mean, we're talking about prime contractors and maybe one or two contractors, but you've got a trade show where you have essentially 200 little companies doing their own little thing on the floor. And something that we incorporated into our contracts with shows of that size is we hire, and the show absorbs the cost, is a construction safety officer. And that's a thing. I didn't know about that before, but it's a course, it's something you take, and it's one person that is a roaming safety officer on behalf of the venue, and they go, hey, you get off that top rung, and hey, you don't, stop speeding around on your forklift and stuff like that. So they're there to protect the venue and to protect each individual little company from doing bad things.
Thank you. Well, and that goes back to the earlier conversation about safety coordinators. CSO is actually a designation in BC and then now nationwide. There's an NCSO program which talks about safety leadership on sites, is essentially what the role is for. And the role of a CSO is to take the safety program of the prime or the contractor, whoever, and I hate the word enforce it, but communicate it on their behalf to the workers. Right? That's their role. It's a very interesting role. I have done the CSO course. It was really interesting, and it's one of the things that we want to apply to safety coordinators. And I like safety coordinator. Officer just sounds so regulatory, but anyway, coordinator is for me a far more approachable phrase. But that's a great point, Chris. And having those people to do that work on the floor also really helps clarify. It says, hey, we're supplying you the person to talk to, regardless of what your plans are. You can always come to them for advice, guidance, and help. And that is just such a major thing. And primes, as far as I'm concerned, should be doing that. And I think that's a big part of what we should be doing. Right now, and one of the interesting things, again, that has spun off from COVID, is COVID coordinators, that's what Worksafe wants to see. They want to know somebody on site is responsible for that role. And it's clearly defined that. What it's also done, in some cases, is added another crew member to shows. So that's also been a little bit of a thing that you might want to watch out for as the prime contractor or the venue owner. You might want to look out for that, because that's something that's going to be popping up more and more. Will, did you have anything to add to that one?
Not really. I think you covered it well. Yeah.
Yep. Officer Parman, yes, sir. Stop it, Cooper. Whomever is on paper as PC or SO or whatever, nobody is off the liability hook for doing their due diligence. Great point, Mr. Chung. Yes, absolutely. Even though you're assigned as a construction safety officer, the responsibility, and they tell you this in the CSO course, still actually lands with the prime. So whether that be the building owner, the contractor, whatever, that's still, it's going to work its way back up the chain to that end user. And everybody below there still has rules that they have to fulfill. And if you want to know more about those, come and take Performing Arts Safety for Supervisors, Performing Arts Safety Awareness, and Joint Health and Safety Committee training at Actsafe, which are free and are now virtual. So those help clarify some of the questions, although, and Cam Stewart knows this really well, even though it answers some questions, it opens up many more, doesn't it, brother? So that's why we're here today, because we keep opening this prime contractor door. This is really good information to discuss with Worksafe. Them hearing you talk about this is a really important part of next steps. So although this is kind of a odd, disjointed way to do it, it's good intel for them to get. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. Originally, I had planned this to be to have panelists, including Worksafe BC. It's so contentious that my panelists were like, I don't think this is a good idea, because, within many of the organizations were like, I don't think we know what we want to do with this yet. And I was like, okay. So this happened, 2 weeks ago? I think it was about 2 weeks ago, and I just said, okay, in fairness to everybody, let's remove that. Let's not worry about that part of it. Let's open it up to everybody to have a voice in this, and let me take all that information back to Worksafe. I will be sharing this video with them. And I will, it's only being shared with a small team. It's not going to Worksafe in general. It's going with the team we work with, which is a team of 4 to 5 people that we regularly converse with. And we're going to sit down and have a chat. I'm going to make them watch the majority of this. I might fast forward through a few bits to get them to the good stuff. And then I'm pulling the scenarios out of this to present to them. I presented them with 5 pages of scenarios the last time we did this, before they would even agree to come to the table. So they've been a great part of the conversation, and they will be further to the discussion as we move forward. Other questions? I'd like to see a whimsical animated Prime. Shameless plug for my classmates and I. Any tips for graduates from BC IT OHS program this May? Oh boy. You know what, Patrick, you may want to bring that question to What Would Dawn Do on Saturday afternoon. That would be a really good place for us to bring that one up, for sure. Or during the session, which is called Why COVID Training Sucks. Might also be a good place for a BCIT graduate to come and talk about those things. Will?
Yeah, also, actually, one of the things that the Actsafe safety team does is participate in a group called Canadian Society for Safety Engineers. And it's a networking group that you may or may not have heard of in your class. And I would suggest, if you get the opportunity, to reach out to local chapters there. They can help you along with your safety travels. And if you're interested in safety travels with regard to this industry, stay in contact with Actsafe and look for more opportunities, as Don suggested.
Yeah, that's a nice little, and that's, just so you all know, that's how I got to know Travis Robertson, is through CSSC. Great group, lots of other information there. And don't forget, Actsafe is not your only source of information. You've got Worksafe BC's got a ton of resources. There's other safety organizations. Safety Driven's another good one. BC Construction Safety Alliance, huge number of resources and courses, because a lot of our stuff, Amandeep's like, yes, and we trade materials all the time. We're always talking to each other about, shop safety, tool safety. I can pull stuff from them. So getting a little bit off the Prime Contractor topic, but all things that all play into those questions. So we're at 10:22. Are there any other scenarios that you guys want to put forward before we start to wrap up? Excellent.
I was going to go back a little bit, backtrack, just as there's a little bit of a pause here. I'm going to step it into reverse, and I'm going to go back to the CSO conversation a little bit. And the CSO is a very tough role to play. You're trying to balance what some people call a black line, which is procedures that are created in our minds about how work is done. And then also the blue line, which is how work actually gets completed on time in order to make productions happen. So the CSO role, whether it's in construction or whether it's in arts, is a bit of a challenging spot to be in, but a very necessary role as well, because unfortunately, as much as Don and I believe, we're very much in the belief that if we talk to people and educate and advise, most people will get on board and we won't have problems, but there is a small percentage.
I'm just going to interrupt you there, Will, because Jeremy at the Mary Winspear has a question.
Oh.
And then Amandeep. So we're going to go. Jeremy, you there? Sam's looking for him.
Jeremy, you're unmuted now.
Hey, thanks very much. I just wanted to share the basic observation here that it really feels like a big axis of this conversation is a question of whether we're speaking proactively or reactively. And in that light, I wanted to share, I have had the experience of being on the trades work site in the last couple of years, as well as the entertainment work site here on the island. And, the other end of an example of sort of this not necessarily working could be in the construction industry, where all of this stuff on paper looks good. And when we're asking the question, who is responsible, the answer is out there. The right amount of communication has been done. And yet every trade that I saw on the job site would do unsafe activities like working outside on balconies with no railings as a way to try and get better ventilation for dust creating activities even. So sometimes you're doing something dangerous in order to be more safe in another category. So it's important to remember that this thing that we're doing here and having this conversation about how to reach toward an improved practice allows us to avail ourselves of all those tools then that are out there in terms of procedure and information and knowledge base. But it's so much about the intent that we come to the table with and whether we make choices that apply all this really good knowledge.
Absolutely, Jeremy. Thank you very much for that. Because we're short on time, I'm going to go right to Amandeep.
Yeah, I just want to say a huge kudos, Will and Dawn, to both of you guys. This session was absolutely amazing. I've been doing virtual conferences, webinars, seminars, meetings since same time last year. So huge. Also to everybody else on this session here, Dawn and Will have a lot of safety connections. So definitely, guys, reach out to them, use them. Their networks are huge, absolutely huge. And that's actually how I met Will and Dawn. So yeah, big. This was so engaging and I absolutely loved it. So really great presentation. You guys killed it.
Thanks so much.
Mic drop.
And great to see you. Thank you for being here. I haven't seen you in over a year, I think.
I know.
We got a chance to chat. So, yes, thank you, everybody. This has been absolutely outstanding. Our worries about getting questions in worked really well. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to hand it off now to Sam and Graham and Natalie to wrap us up. So make sure you get to that trade show floor, everybody.
Well, that was fantastic section, eh? Thank you, Don and Will as well.